Friends, good evening. This is an urgent broadcast. We are live on air. Zelensky has named the time frame when the war in Ukraine could end, and he has appointed Sviatlana Tikhanovskaya as the president of Belarus. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping is humiliating Putin and making it clear that striking Kyiv again would be deadly dangerous for the most despicable little Putin. And also, a general mobilization in Russia is just around the corner. Russians are being summoned en masse to military enlistment offices and being handed mobilization notices. Greetings, friends. This is the At the Target project. I am Vladimir Timoshenko, and we are starting. Let's start with this. Against the backdrop of threats of a new invasion from Belarus, the leader of the Belarusian opposition, Sviatlana Tikhanovskaya, arrived in Kyiv. You know about this. And Zelensky didn't miss the chance to stylishly troll the mustachioed war criminal Lukashenko. During his address to the participants of the 4th International Summit of Cities and Regions, Partnership, Sustainability, Readiness, the president of Ukraine recalled the self-proclaimed president of Belarus. Here's how he remembered him. Take a look.
And recently, Lukashenko said that the president of Ukraine and Belarus. It's time to meet with him. It is quite a fascinating turn of events. While Lukashenko was the one who made those initial public statements, it was actually Sviatlana Tikhanovskaya who unexpectedly decided to show up here today. We are truly and genuinely glad to have the opportunity to see you and welcome you in person, Sviatlana.
Yes, that was beautiful, friends. I want to point out that you can write comments and ask questions under our YouTube broadcast. We'll discuss and interact with you live and in real time. And one more important aspect. The publication Ukrainska Pravda reports that the day before, President Zelensky met with the Servant of the People faction. During this meeting, they discussed the prospects for ending the war and the economy. Zelensky allegedly noted that in 6 months, it will be possible to force Russia into substantive negotiations and to end the war. How realistic is this scenario at all, considering the situation on the front line? That is exactly what our next segment is about. Let's watch, and then we'll return to the studio.
Zelensky has named the timeline for the end of the hot phase of the war. The aggressor country, Russia, is trying to compensate for its failures with strikes on the rear, a new anti-record for the occupying army at the front. More on this in the following report. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has revealed possible timelines for the end of the hot phase of the war. According to NRD, Olga Vasilevska-Smaglyuk from the Servant of the People Party reported that the head of state shared this information during a meeting with the faction. According to her, the president noted that there is a possibility of ending the hot phase by November, provided that security guarantees are given.
Right now, we have advantages on the front that we can take advantage of. The main goal, not to allow the Russian Federation the opportunity to deceive and, after a short pause, start new hostilities, a new offensive.
In addition, Volodymyr Zelensky told the MPs that he expects Europe to determine who will now act as the moderator of the peace process. Ukraine is also expecting a delegation from the United States in the near future. At the same time, in his evening address, Zelensky stated that Ukraine has stabilized the front. According to him, the positions of the Ukrainian military have become stronger.
Thanks to the courage of our people, thanks to drones, various technologies of ours, middle strikes, and our long-range sanctions, we have managed to stabilize the front.
Meanwhile, the situation of the aggressor country on the front is deteriorating. This was stated by Michael Kaufman, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, in an interview with New York Magazine. According to him, the way the Russian army is waging the war is yielding fewer and fewer results.
The Russian leadership was betting on constant pressure along the entire front line. Not on large-scale breakthroughs, but on intensive small operations across a wide front, with the aim of exhausting Ukrainian forces and possibly causing the front to collapse. But that did not happen. And now this seems even less likely given the adaptation of the Ukrainian military.
According to the analyst, Russia is trying to compensate for its failures at the front with strikes on the rear. And because of this, it is ramping up the production of attack drones and increasing the use of ballistic missiles. At the same time, Kaufman notes that Ukraine is in a better position than before.
In fact, it is showing better results than many expected. In the fall of 2024, the situation looked difficult, but then the front stabilized. The Ukrainian political leadership has a fairly good understanding of the real state of affairs. And that is precisely why there is no willingness to agree to unfavorable or burdensome ceasefire terms.
The analyst concluded that time is increasingly not on Russia's side. The Russians were counting either on the collapse of the Ukrainian front or on the breakdown of Western support for Ukraine. But neither of these scenarios has materialized. At the same time, the pace of Russian advances is rapidly decreasing. As the news agency reports, in May, Russia captured the smallest area on the front since March 2024. According to the Autumn Deep State project, from May 1st to May 24th, Russia managed to capture only 35 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. At the same time, the defense forces continue to regain control over Ukrainian territories. Analysts believe that final conclusions about the scale of problems in the Russian army can be drawn by the end of June. If by that time the pace of the offensive does not increase significantly, it will be possible to conclude that the offensive capabilities of the Russian military have noticeably decreased.
So friends, now we have an extremely important topic. You remember Putin promises to strike at decision-making centers in Kyiv. There, the Speaker of the State Duma, this Volodyn character, today even decided to scare the capital of Ukraine with nuclear weapons. But at the same time, friends, attention, Putin's master, and at the same time the real owner of Russia, Xi Jinping, enters the game. On his orders, a representative of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, this Mao Ning, while commenting on Russia's threats to deliver, quote, systemic strikes on targets in Kyiv, called on the relevant parties to refrain from escalating hostilities. So what exactly is behind such a convoluted wording? More on this in the following segment.
Russia continues to escalate its threats not only against Ukraine but also against NATO countries. And against this backdrop, an unexpected signal came from China, the Kremlin's main international partner. Mao Ning, a representative of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, commenting on Russia's threats to launch new systematic strikes on Kyiv, stated that China opposes further escalation and calls on both sides to return to dialogue. According to the Chinese diplomat, negotiations remain the only way to resolve the war. This statement came immediately after Moscow had effectively announced a new wave of strikes on the Ukrainian capital. The head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Sergei Lavrov, conveyed a message from Vladimir Putin through U.S. Secretary of State Mark Rubio about Russia's readiness to launch new strikes on Kyiv. But just a day later, contradictory statements began to emerge within Russia itself. The head of the State Duma Defense Committee, Andrei Kartapolov, stated that Russia supposedly does not intend to attack the Verkhovna Rada or the office of the President of Ukraine since, according to him, they are not centers of decision-making. At the same time, the Kremlin is expanding its list of external enemies. Now, Russian officials are accusing the Baltic states of allegedly allowing Ukraine to use their airspace to carry out strikes on Russian territory. Latvia has also come under another attack from Russian propaganda. Moscow claims that support for Ukrainian drone attacks is allegedly being provided through the Baltic countries. Riga has categorically rejected these accusations, emphasizing that Ukraine possesses its own long-range drones capable of striking targets on Russian territory. Experts believe that such accusations are linked to the Kremlin's attempt to explain to its own population why Ukrainian drones regularly reach the Moscow, Leningrad, Yaroslavl, and other regions of Russia. At the same time, Moscow is showing signs of preparing for a prolonged war. There has been a sharp increase in the number of mobilization orders in Russia. Citizens are being summoned to military enlistment offices under the pretext of updating their personal information. And interest in the topic of mobilization in search engines has reached record levels. In addition, Vladimir Putin has signed new benefits for those wishing to go to war against Ukraine. New contract soldiers and their families are being promised debt forgiveness of up to 10 million rubles, as well as additional social privileges. Against this backdrop, China's position appears particularly telling. While the Kremlin threatens Kyiv with new strikes, accuses the Baltic states, and continues to ramp up military mobilization, Beijing is publicly calling for an end to the escalation. And this is a signal that Moscow would clearly prefer not to hear.
Yes, I completely agree with this assessment. And friends, now is an important moment. Subscribe to Union to know the truth about what is happening in Ukraine and in the rest of the civilized world. And as they say, into the abyss goes modern Putin's Russia. And by the way, speaking of the Russian abyss, you know, like a nasty little Putinling. Now, as of May 2026, it is luring its loyal Russians into the war in Ukraine. And we're going to tell you about it right now. Look, here's a specific case. The Russian dictator Putin has allowed participants in the war against Ukraine and their families not to pay off overdue loans. This is the first time the head of an aggressor country has allowed the military, the occupying army, and their relatives to not pay those same overdue loans back in November 2024. And now, as they say, we can do it again. Well, what is it called, my respects? Listen, the Kremlin elders would do better not to think about how to protect their Kaliningrad from the attacks of the European Union. New cannon fodder definitely won't help them. What do I mean by that? Now, pay attention, this is also very interesting. So, for the first time, a drone threat has been declared in the Kaliningrad region. After all, the propagandists did warn that the EU or NATO was preparing to occupy this Königsberg. But for now, we're only talking about a potential drone attack. By the way, maybe these are actually Ukrainian drones? Well, the Russian war correspondents are completely shocked and bewildered. They write that in Valdai, unlike in the Kaliningrad region, everything is calm. That's where Putin's dacha is. So there's no need to worry. The body of the main Russian grandpa is well protected. This is what those very Russian Z channels are writing about. Listen, one of the topics of this stream is how the armed forces of Ukraine are tearing the occupiers to shreds. And regarding the claim that the body of the main grandpa Putin is protected, I definitely wouldn't jump to such conclusions. Putin, who is he really? Let's recall the biography of the ugly duckling. He was a KGB officer in Soviet times, then an FSB agent during Yeltsin's era. So the SBU just recently struck the headquarters of the Russian FSB in the Kherson region. About 100 occupiers were killed or wounded. President Zelensky confirmed this. I think that in the near future, the former main swamp FSB agent might get hit too. And how? Here are the details.
Special forces from the SBU Special Operations Center struck the headquarters of the Russian FSB in the village of Henicheska Hirka in the temporarily occupied territory of the Kherson region. This was reported by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky.
The headquarters of Russian FSB personnel was hit, and a Pantsir S-1 air defense system was destroyed on our temporarily occupied territory. Thanks to this single operation alone, Russian losses amounted to about 100 occupiers killed and wounded.
Zelensky also published a video showing several drones simultaneously striking buildings. As the Ukrainian leader emphasized,
the Russians must feel that they need to bring this war of theirs to an end. Ukrainian sanctions of medium and long range will continue to operate.
Earlier, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, instructed the Ukrainian Defense Forces and Special Services to prepare a response to the massive Russian attack. After that, drones soon attacked Moscow and the Moscow region. The President of Ukraine confirmed that the strike on the capital of the aggressor country, Russia, was carried out by Ukrainian drones. Zelensky emphasized that the war unleashed by Russia is gradually returning to its so-called native harbor, the Russian Federation. Meanwhile, on May 20th, the commander of the Unmanned Systems Forces, Robert Brody, reported a strike by Ukrainian defenders on the enemy drone training center in the temporarily occupied territory of Donetsk region.
The destruction of 65 cadets and the head of the PPK Berry Center, a doctor of science from the Academy of Rocket and Artillery Sciences, has been confirmed. The number of wounded is being clarified.
The military clarified that there was a detonation of ammunition in the basement rooms.
So, well, the situation over there in the swamps is heating up for them. Bashkortostan is burning and blazing. That's several thousand kilometers from Ukraine, just for the record. But the point is, what's really going on? Military facilities are burning. Last night, the Intakim oil depot in the village of Kandri caught fire. That's the same Republic of Bashkortostan. And this looks very strange because recently there was an explosion at the Nolina oil pumping station in that same Republic of Bashkortostan. Maybe it's the work of a local sabotage and reconnaissance group, of course, because there haven't been any official reports about Ukrainian drones, although in fact Ukrainian UAVs have already reached Bashkortostan before. But how else can you explain explosion after explosion happening there? Sabotage groups or drones? Write in the comments who you think was actually behind it. Listen, but for that nasty little Putin, this is just the beginning, just the tip of the iceberg. Here's the thing, the legendary Azov is starting to reclaim their native Mariupol. Let me explain what I mean. Here's the essence of it. In the First Corps of the National Guard, Azov demonstrated the destruction of occupier targets near the Russian border, specifically on the Mariupol-Taganrog and Mariupol-Volnovaka highways. Let me quote directly. Azov is patrolling the border area around Mariupol. Pilots of the First Corps of the National Guard of Ukraine, Azov, are already carrying out missions to strike targets near the Russian border. The video shows combat operations on the Mariupol-Taganrog and Mariupol-Volnovakha highways. Safe? There will no longer be any for the occupiers with Azov around. But I want to tell you, moreover, there are no safe places left for Russian soldiers anymore. Anywhere. Want proof? Here you go. Here is a very telling map that we have prepared for you. An updated map of strikes on Russian logistics. As you can see, there are more and more points, and these are strikes. The red dots are strikes on key routes. The white ones are other mid-level strikes. Here is that cluster of red dots between Mariupol and the Russian border. At the bottom right, these are mainly the strikes from today's Azov video, which we just showed you. If you want even more specifics, then please, friends, everything is for you. Here it is, those very specifics. Here is a Russian convoy destroyed by drones 100 kilometers from the front line. The logistics of the Russian armed forces are experiencing some issues, to put it mildly. It's clear now, right, why there's all this hysteria about strikes on Kyiv. Why is it Kyiv? Why is it Moscow? And that's why all these war criminals are so hysterical. So, let's return to the studio. Well, right now, let's talk about the latest successes of Ukrainian drones deep in the Russian rear. Let's watch the report, and for Russians who are watching, draw your own conclusions.
There will no longer be any safe haven near Azov for Russian occupiers. The defense forces are keeping temporarily occupied Mariupol under fire control. Ukrainian drones are striking terror into the occupying army and forcing the enemy to flee from temporarily occupied Crimea. More about this in the following report. The First Corps of the National Guard of Ukraine, Azov, has published a video showing the destruction of targets near the Russian border in the vicinity of temporarily occupied Mariupol. Ukrainian drones are successfully attacking Russian military equipment, disrupting the enemy's logistics. The footage captures combat operations taking place on the roads. Mariupol-Taganrog and Mariupol-Volnovakha. The press service of the 1st Azov Corps notes the following.
The territory of Ukraine must be free of Russian troops. The most reliable way to achieve this is to move the sanitary zone for enemy logistics closer to Russia itself and the occupied Crimea.
Earlier, pilots of the 1st Azov National Guard Corps demonstrated the operation of reconnaissance and strike complexes. In Mariupol, they also announced that roads are being patrolled at distances of up to 160 kilometers from the line of combat engagement. Strikes were carried out on the so-called Novorossiya highway. Logistics is increasingly becoming the main vulnerability of the Russian army. Even the Russians admit that the land corridor to temporarily occupied Crimea is under Ukrainian fire control. The occupation authorities have restricted the movement of civilian freight transport toward Crimea along the federal highway R280, stating that these measures are being introduced to ensure the safety of transit road traffic. As reported by the publication Arya Yug, due to the appearance of middle strike class drones in the arsenal of the Ukrainian armed forces, there are no longer any safe routes for Russian troops in southern Ukraine. There are practically none left. Burning fuel trucks and destroyed military vehicles are regularly recorded along the key highways of the occupied territories.
On the Melitopol bypass and at key junctions, truck drivers observe the scene. Cabins burned to the ground and tankers torn in half. There is information that the occupiers have already been forbidden to move military equipment in convoys. Now they try to slip through one by one or transport cargo for the Russian army in civilian trucks.
Defense forces are also successfully striking their legitimate targets on the territory of temporarily occupied Crimea. And with the development of Ukrainian drone production, hitting targets in the aggressor country will become even easier. As reported by Dennis Stillerman, the chief designer of the company Firepoint, the FP2 drone, after modernization, received an increased warhead weighing 200 kilograms and now has a strike range of up to 370 kilometers. Now this UAV will be able to reach any target in occupied Crimea. At the same time, the defense forces continue to regain control over Ukrainian territories. As reported recently by the spokesperson of the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, Serhiy Brachuk, the armed forces of Ukraine have completely cleared the settlement of Stepnohersk and thwarted the Russians' plans to shell the city of Zaporizhzhia.
Thanks to our special forces, in particular the Artan Special Unit of the Main Intelligence Directorate, the defense forces managed to regain control over Stepnohersk and reclaim our tactical positions that had been lost there.
According to data from the Institute for the Study of War, Mala Tokmachka in the Zaporizhzhia region has also been liberated. In addition, the defense forces of Ukraine have regained control over the village of Radnya in the Kharkiv region and the surrounding areas.
So, friends, as promised, I'm reading your comments under this broadcast. So, Larisa Vinogradova writes, here's what I think is amazing. Quoting, Iskandars are not laughing, Topals are downcast, the missile bearers. In Russia, everyone is changing their underwear, but Kyiv stands and will continue to stand. Really, that's well said. In fact, Kyiv does stand, but this is an allegory about how the missile bearers in Russia are all changing. Their underwear. You know, as they say, you reap what you sow. Thank you for watching us and leaving your comments. Keep it up. Here's another very telling story. How Russian military commanders are robbing their own mobilized soldiers. Look, on the right-hand side. Shoigu had assets worth almost $77 million seized. A court in a closed session confiscated the property of former First Deputy Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, Ruslan Tsalikov, and his family. They had their luxury apartments, plots in prestigious settlements, commercial real estate in Moscow, properties in North Ossetia, and all the money in their accounts taken away. Tsalikov has already become the fourth high-ranking official from Shoigu's inner circle to be caught up in anti-corruption cases. And this is happening against the backdrop of what is going on with Russian conscripts at the front. You know, those true, real stories where there aren't even enough body bags to pack up the dead representatives of what's supposed to be the second army in the world. So, what's happening on the main fronts? That's exactly what our next segment is about.
The armed forces of Ukraine have completely cleared the village of Stepnohirsk and thwarted the Russians' plans to shell the city of Zaporizhzhia. This was reported by Serhiy Brachuk, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army. According to him, the enemy aimed to secure positions on the commanding heights and bring in heavy artillery there.
Thanks to our special forces, particularly the Artan Special Unit of the Main Intelligence Directorate, the Defense Forces managed to regain control of Stepnohirsk. To regain our tactical positions that had been lost there.
Brachuk notes that the enemy tried to counterattack Stepnohirsk but was defeated. The loss of these positions is quite painful for the Russians. The spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army also said that the situation at the front forced the occupiers to redeploy some of their units to the Mariupol direction, where extremely intense fighting is currently taking place. Meanwhile, Ukraine's defense forces are keeping the occupiers' land corridor to temporarily occupied Crimea under fire control. As reported by the publication Aria Yog, thanks to the introduction of middle strike-class drones into the arsenal of the Ukrainian armed forces, there are practically no safe routes left for Russian troops in southern Ukraine. Burning fuel trucks and destroyed military vehicles are regularly observed along the key highways of the occupied territories. The article notes this. On
the Melitopol bypass and at key junctions, truck drivers observe cabins burned to the ground and tankers torn in half. There is information that the occupiers have already been forbidden to move military equipment in convoys. Now they try to slip through one by one or transport cargo for the Russian army in civilian trucks.
As reported by the Telegram channel Kremlin Snuffbox, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin was informed that the head of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, is deceiving him about the situation at the front. According to the channel's source, Putin was shown maps, satellite images, and provided with data on losses. It is noted that the Kremlin leader is upset by what is happening and has ordered additional inspections.
Well, friends, this was the project. Insight. Subscribe, leave comments, because it is very important to us. Every day we tell the truth about what is happening in Ukraine and the rest of the civilized world. And of course, the real horror that is happening right now in Putin's Russia. We fully understand that these are difficult events, difficult times, a terrible war unleashed by Putin. We are constantly expecting strikes from the Russian Federation. We need to stick together, and it is very important to maintain information hygiene and only get news from verified sources. The Union YouTube channel is here to help you. This was Volodymyr Timoshenko with you. We will definitely see each other soon. Bye.